So today is the third in a series of 4 talks that I'm giving this spring on a text called the Bendowa, or a talk on the Wholehearted Practice of the Way by the founder of our tradition, Dogen Zenji. And Dogen wrote the Bendowa a few years after he returned to Japan from China, and he tells us that he's writing to share the practice that he observed and the teachings that he received while he was in China. And he's writing to tell people how to follow this way. Right? He's telling us what to do if we want to actualize the wisdom of the Buddhas and ancestors in our own lives. So I want to talk this morning a little bit about what exactly is he telling us to do, right? What is he telling us to practice? So in a very direct sense, he's telling us to sit zazen. We are Soto Zen Buddhists. That's the central practice of our tradition. And he's really clear that he's telling people to sit zazen. Za means sitting or seated, and zen means meditation, so seated meditation. And he says that Buddhist practitioners should center their practice in seated meditation, and that all Buddhas and ancestors throughout space and time who realize the way rely on this practice, on this Dharma. After all, Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha in this world, sat under the Bodhi tree, right? That's the story that comes down to us. And right in the beginning of the text, there's a line that practicing zazen in an upright posture is the true gate. And he goes on in a lot of the rest of the text in the question and answers to fairly harshly criticize other schools and teachings that were prevalent in his time. And it's easy to read this as kind of this way that I'm telling you is the right way, and all other ideas about how to practice are wrong. But if that was really what he's teaching us, I don't think we would be here today, because I don't think our tradition would have lasted. It would be pretty brittle and pretty flimsy. So I want to talk about a little bit broader sense of what he's telling us how to practice. How do we read this in a kind of a deeper way of what it is to practice zazen, a more alive way? And right in that line, practicing zazen in an upright posture is the true gate, is a way to start thinking about this. That the in the true gate is a function of English. We need the preposition to tell us that it's the true gate or a true gate. But in Japanese, they don't need that. So in Japanese, it's more zazen is true gate. And that's a function of language, but it's also indicative of how Dogen writes and speaks about the Dharma. And he's teaching us about zazen that is true gate because it's not in opposition to false gate. He's talking about seated meditation that's not limited to sitting or lying down. It's the true gate because it has no edges. So a big section of this text is question and answers, where there's kind of a hypothetical questioner asking a question that he can then sort of belittle and then go on to give a deeper answer, right? So in question number 5, the hypothetical questioner is talking about basically saying meditation is one of the 6 perfections, one of the 3 basic practices. So why is it, I have to get my glasses out. Actually, exactly what he said. Why do you say that the true Dharma of the Tathagatas is consolidated in this one practice, right? Yes, meditation is one thing that Buddhists do, but why are you saying that the true Dharma of the Tathagatas, which is another name for a Buddha, is contained in this one practice? And Dogen says that people called this school the Zen school because they misunderstood what Bodhidharma was transmitting. And Bodhidharma was the first Zen ancestor. He brought these teachings from India to China in about 500 AD, and he famously sat facing a wall for 9 years. And so Dogen says that people saw the shape of what he was doing and mistook that for the core of what he was transmitting, and they called him the Brahman who practices zazen as the essence. And Dogen says, don't take zazen to be the concentration of the 6 paramitas or perfections. Don't take it to be the meditation of the 6 perfections. So don't take zazen, seated meditation, to be the meditation that they're talking about in the paramitas. But he doesn't mean that it's a different kind of meditation, that it's a superior meditation. It's that if we think that zazen is just this concentration, then we don't get what zazen is. But we also don't get what the other perfections are. Right? As soon as we think that it's one practice that I can hold up into opposition to other practices, then I've turned it into an object and I've missed it. And the same can be said of the other perfections, kind of the other core practices that we work with. If I take a generosity and I hold it up as something that I can talk about in opposition to, say, forbearance, then I'm missing generosity, but I'm also missing forbearance. There's still maybe a useful thing that I could put into practice in my life and I could get something out of it, but it stops being a bridge for crossing over, which is another way to talk about the perfections. And in the same answer, Dogen goes on to say that the Buddha's intention to transmit this Dharma is revealed in his own life. But then he doesn't tell us about Shakyamuni teaching people to sit in meditation or about how he demonstrated that. He goes on to talk about the transmission of the Dharma to Mahakashapa at Vulture Peak. And this is a really famous story. It's the first transmission of the Dharma in this world. And the story is that the historical Buddha was going to give a sermon, and for his sermon he picked a flower and gazed at it, and Mahakashapa smiled. And the Buddha said, I transmit to you the true Dharma eye treasury of the wondrous mine of nirvana. So this isn't a story about teaching a specific practice. It's a story about transmitting the whole of the Buddha Dharma. So the zazen that Dogen is telling us about here is the whole of the Buddha Dharma. And we shouldn't get hung up on the shape of it, what we can see or conceive of. Right? And this might sound at odds with how we often talk about zazen. You know, if you've taken a zazen class with me, I talk a lot about the physicality of zazen. Right? We talk about taking up the Buddha mudra. And mudra is literally a way to talk about a shape. And Dogen uses that term in this text too. But to say that zazen is the whole of the Dharma and it's not limited to what we can see or conceive doesn't mean that the actual physical practice of zazen isn't important. It means that it matters completely. But it matters in a way that doesn't have edges, that nothing is outside of it. It's also easy to get the impression that Zen traditions in particular are anti-study or anti-intellectual. And that's a common kind of misconception about Zen. In the Bendowa, Dogen says, from the moment you engage with a teacher, all other practices, including studying sutras, are basically unnecessary. Just sit, dropping off body and mind. That's a really classic phrase. Just sit, dropping off body and mind. But if you spend time here at the temple, you know that bowing and chanting and prostrations and offering and work practice and sutra study. These are all really important core things that we do all the time. And if you read Dogen, he's deeply rooted in classical Buddhist texts. And he's clearly writing for an audience that is also steeped in those texts. One of the reasons it can feel so opaque to us is that his writing is packed with references to other stories and other texts, and he doesn't explain them because he assumes that his audience will be able to make those connections themselves. So, what are we supposed to do with that, right? So I want to read a section in the Bendowa where our hypothetical questioner is asking about other traditions that were prevalent in their time, specifically some teachings of the Shingon school, that mind itself is Buddha, and or mind becomes Buddha, and that awakening occurs at the moment of sitting without passing through kalpas of practice. And he's asking Dogen why he recommends zazen, this dharma he's presenting, over these teachings. He says, clearly, this is the pinnacle of the Buddha Dharma. Why would you recommend this other practice over this teaching? And this sounds a lot like Dogen talking about practice enlightenment. Right? Later in the same question, in his answer, Dogen says that when we thoroughly practice zazen, we immediately receive and use great awakening. So how is that different from achieving enlightenment right at the moment of sitting? Right? So Dogen says, Buddhist practitioners should know not to argue about the superiority or inferiority of teachings and not to discriminate between superficial or profound dharma, but should only know whether the practice is genuine or false. There were those who flowed into the Buddha way drawn by grasses, flowers, mountains, or rivers, and there are some who received and upheld the Buddha mudra from grasping earth, stones, sand, or pebbles. Furthermore, words that express the vastness of reality are even more abundant than all the myriad things. But also the turning of the great Dharma wheel is contained in one speck of dust. Therefore, the words, the mind itself is Buddha, are like the moon reflected in the water. The principle at the instant of sitting becoming Buddha is also a reflection within a mirror. Don't be caught up in the skillfulness of words. Now, in order to allow you to become an authentic person of the way, I recommend truly engaging in practice that directly actualizes Bodhi, and I'm showing you the wondrous way that is simply transmitted by Buddha ancestors. That's a lot, but I'm going to read it again. Buddhist practitioners should know not to argue about the superiority or inferiority of teachings and not to discriminate between superficial or profound dharma, but should only know whether the practice is genuine or false. There were those who flowed into the Buddha way drawn by grasses, flowers, mountains, or rivers, and there are some who received and upheld the Buddha mudra from grasping earth, stones, sand, or pebbles. Furthermore, words that express the vastness of reality are even more abundant than all the myriad things. But also the turning of the great Dharma wheel is contained in one speck of dust. Therefore, the words, the mind itself is Buddha, are like the moon reflected in the water. The principle at the instant of sitting becoming Buddha is also a reflection within a mirror. Don't be caught up in the skillfulness of words. Now, in order to allow you to become an authentic person of the way, I recommend truly engaging in practice that directly actualizes Bodhi, and I'm showing you the wondrous way that is simply transmitted by Buddha ancestors. So there's a lot in there, but it's all relevant. But I want to focus on mind itself is Buddha, is like the moon reflected in the water. And becoming Buddha at the moment of sitting is also a reflection in a mirror. So this image of the moon reflected in water is really common in Zen teachings. And here it's telling us that this idea, mind itself is Buddha, right? That it's not really the thing. The moon reflected in the water isn't really the moon. We can see something, and it shows us something, but it's like it's pointing at the thing itself. And if we touch the water, we don't touch the moon, we just touch the water. Right? And it's easy to read this as these ideas are wrong. They're somehow kind of missing the point. And if we practice zazen, that's going to be the cure. Right? That's going to get us to the real thing. But just sit, dropping off body and mind, is also the moon reflected in the water. Okay? It's not that mind itself is Buddha or becoming Buddha at the moment of sitting is wrong, but that having an idea doesn't liberate us. It doesn't transform suffering, no matter how good the idea is. Okay? If we want to know mind itself is Buddha, or if we want to know just sit, dropping off body and mind, we have to unfold our life through it. As soon as we see a teaching as one among many, as something we can hold up and say it's this and it's not that, and we can talk about it in opposition to other things, we've made it an object, and it can't be the whole of the Buddha Dharma. It can't be the whole of the way. So the spoiler alert is that we do that all the time, and we're not going to stop doing it, right? Setting up the world into subjects in relation to our object is how our mind works. And we are going to spend our lives finding new and interesting ways that we are turning things into objects, even the Dharma. And that can sound kind of disheartening or like it's hopeless, but it's actually liberating. Or as Hojo-san might say, it's the good news. Okay? It's a mark of our particular time and place of modern life, particularly in the United States anyway, that we have this feeling, we tend to have this feeling that we should do absolutely everything and we should do it perfectly, and that causes great anxiety. And I don't know how it was in Dogen's time, but that's definitely something that we struggle with now. So we are never going to be the whatever the Instagram influencer version of a bodhisattva is. Right? So we can just relax about that. So for me, the question becomes, how do I rely on zazen? Not how do I get really good at it, not how much is exactly the right amount to sit, am I doing it enough or not? But how am I going to unfold my life through zazen at this time? And this should always feel like kind of a pointy question. We should never feel like we're off the hook. Right? We're never going to arrive at an answer that's going to stay the answer. It's going to change as life changes, or from moment to moment, situation to situation. And it's not about how much zazen I sit, or how much time I spend at the temple, or how much I make offerings. But it's also not an excuse to say that that doesn't matter. Right? Don't get hung up on the shape of zazen. Doesn't mean that actually sitting zazen doesn't matter. It means it matters completely. Right? But it matters how I unfold this through my own life, or how it unfolds me, right? So for me, at times in my life, that's meant that zazen kind of happened in the cracks between other things, often sitting in a car waiting to pick kids up. Right? It meant that making offerings was about how I cooked food for people or cared for my family. And not about putting things on an altar. And if your life is on the other side of that right now, if you live at the temple or you get to come every morning and you go home and you sit every night, that doesn't let you off the hook either. Right? You don't get a stamp of approval that that's how you do it. The question is always, how can I unfold my life through zazen at this time? How can zazen unfold my life? For me so far, at this time, I think a lot about that in terms of how do I meet beings through zazen. And the practice structure or ritual structure that I get to have in my day at this point in my life is about supporting, it's what supports that inquiry. Right? So that seems to be what the question is for me so far. But, what is your question? Right? How does practice support your inquiry? How do you rely on it? Not as a tool to get something done or to accomplish your goals, but how do you let it manipulate you? How do you let practice twist and turn you and change your life? And before I finish, I want to share a line from a question 7, for anybody who's reading it, where Dogen is talking about the indivisibility of practice and awakening. Practice enlightenment is one of Dogen's core teachings, that they cannot be separated. And he says, also it was said, a person who sees the way practices the way. So we come to a temple, we hear some teachings, and we see a different way to live. And if that calls to us in some way, we take up that practice, right? And maybe because we're human, when we hear that line, we also think something like, do I practice enough to be someone who sees the way? Do I count? Am I good enough? Or maybe, thank goodness I'm one of the people who practices the way instead of all those poor sad people over there who don't, right? But this is the first line of a poem by an 8th century Chinese ancestor that goes, one who sees the way practices the way. But for one who doesn't see it, what's the practice? The nature of the way is like empty space. What's there to practice in empty space? One who sees the way practices the way. But for one who doesn't see it, what's the practice? The nature of the way is like empty space. What's there to practice in empty space? So we talk a lot about emptiness. Right? All things are empty of self-nature. And that can be a hard teaching. It feels hard sometimes. And it's easy to grab onto practice as kind of a lifeboat that's going to make emptiness manageable and give us some place to stand. Also, it's easy to get a little bit pretentious or precious about practice. But practice is also empty. And it has to be, or else it couldn't be the Buddha Dharma. And what's there to practice in empty space doesn't mean there's nothing to practice. So my encouragement is to not put too much thought into trying to figure that out, but to just let the what rattle around and see what it stirs up. And see what it feels like to bring that what is there to practice in empty space to your zazen, and just let it stay open. So that's what I have, and we have some time for questions.
Jikie, could you say a little more about first of all, seeing the way, I don't know that can be concrete, or more obviously not. But the phrase sets up something that is possible, right? And then, I don't know how to say this really, but the relationship of relying to the unseen, the relationship of is actually everything to the unseen that's not consciously directed. So how much of what you're talking about, I don't know if this is making any sense, comes from this other place?
I mean, I think we're either completely talking about one side or the other side, right? There's the gate of what I can see, but seeing is a marker for kind of all senses, what I can perceive, what I can be aware of, right? So when we talk about seen and unseen. And that's one side. And then for one who doesn't see it, what's the practice? That's the other side. What about what we can't see, right? And I think when we talk about the relationship of relying on with the unseen, that's the only thing that we can rely on, right? It's like in the Heart Sutra where it says all bodhisattvas rely on prajnaparamita, that prajnaparamita, that great wisdom, the perfection of wisdom, these are teachings about emptiness, right? About the unseen, about what we can't grab hold of, can't conceive of, and that's the only thing that we actually can rely on. And I think I'm kind of riffing a little bit off your question now, but that when it feels like, I said we kind of try to make practice into a place to stand, right? That no place to stand is a way of talking about how this emptiness feels like it's something that I can't grab onto it. I can't have a fixed idea about it. I can't get it to hold still so I can understand it and know what it is in a way that feels satisfying. And that can feel really challenging. Like, well, what do I do from there? How can I act from that place? But the reality is, or a reality is, that it's exactly that unknowability that makes it a place that we can stand up and act. It's what makes the world alive, right? And it's what makes the Dharma alive.
Jikie. Oh, thank you so much. What you were saying about how zazen unfolds your life, how you unfold zazen in your life and how zazen unfolds your life, it reminded me of something I heard years ago, which I completely didn't understand, and I'm still not understanding, that Kyogen Carlson said, once you sit down on that cushion, your life's never going to be the same. And I was thinking, I sat down on a cushion like this a long time ago, and my life was the same for a very, very, very long time. So, what is that? What is that sense that there's something?
Was it really?
Was my life the same?
Yeah. Really?
You can ask my husband. No, but what is that?
We used to say the same thing in Aikido. My teacher used to say, I feel like I should warn people when they come in. You don't know what you're getting into. Your life will never be the same. I think as soon as we start to sit and pay attention, right? As soon as we start to inquire deeply. I mean, we could sit on a cushion and not inquire about anything. I don't think that was you, but we could, right? But as soon as we actually really try to bring our heart to unfolding this way and practicing this practice, we start to see ourselves and the world in a different way, and we can't not respond. And what that looks like changes over time. I mean, it changes with our experience in practice. And be careful with that. You know, when we say there's nothing to attain, and we don't practice zazen in order to get something or to change who we are. But it's not that change doesn't happen. Of course, we grow and we mature in our practice, and our understanding of the world shifts. But it changes how we are able to respond to beings. If I'm really starting to pay attention right from the beginning, I can't quite see other people and myself and the world in the same way that I did before. That's what I think.
Jikie, there's a more severe version, I think, of what Myobun is asking, which we used to joke about at the temple. We haven't mentioned it in a while, but I don't know who started saying this, but it was along the lines of, when you start practice, it will ruin your life. It's related, and I've always thought about this, especially when we teach intro, when people are coming for the first time with questions. I think that there is a huge desire for relief in our society now, from all kinds of trauma or the stress and anxiety of our time. And there is a part of me that has always read that your life is going to be ruined through the lens of, you will see how messed up your life has been, and you're going to live a better life. Or you're going to see that things you've been doing, how wrong things have been, and that the practice is going to make something better. It's going to give you relief from that. And I see how inaccurate that read is. But can you talk a little bit about the sense of we look at I think we sometimes look for markers that this is worthwhile, that the endless hopelessness of that there will be some kind of can you either dissuade us from that trajectory, or is there no hope?
There's no hope. But that's not a bad thing. I mean, as fun as it is to say that zazen is going to ruin your life, and I will go there, but I want to start with, because I don't want to scare the whole world, that I can't say that zazen does not bring relief from all those things. It just doesn't bring the relief that I thought it was going to, right? It doesn't bring relief in the way that I thought it was going to, because I couldn't have conceived before I started practicing of what that shift was going to be. And when I think about the marks of whether or not this is worth it, I think of what do I see in the lives of people who practice away. And to digress slightly, that paragraph I read where he said, Buddhist practitioners should know not to argue about whether teachings are true, or argue about teachings. They should just know if the practice is true or false. How do we know if the practice is true or false, especially when we're new, right? When you go into a temple, or when you meet people who are practitioners of a certain lineage, is there something there that makes you go, I want to participate in that, right? That's the mark for me that it's worthwhile, is what I see happening in the lives of people who practice it. And then, but it will ruin your life. In a way, what I think of is back to that, I can't help but respond, right? As I start to see something different in the world, as I start to see into the non-duality of things, right? The non-separation of things, into the nature of impermanence, there's kind of two sides to that. And one of them is very hard. Right? And when we talk about the perfection of patience or forbearance, one of the kind of flavors of that is forbearing the implications of the Dharma, right? I will see things in this practice about the nature of the world that break my heart a lot. And that kind of destroy the dreams and visions I thought of what life was going to be. And not necessarily the big, like the plans with the, like, I'm going to have a house, or I'm going to have a partner, or, you know, whatever, I'm going to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. Not those kind of plans for my life, but I'm going to somehow set things up so that everything's going to be okay. Like, that's gone. That's not going to happen. Okay? And in that sense, it kind of ruins our plans for our lives. But it does that by bringing in something that is infinitely more valuable and infinitely more nourishing.
Jikie? Let's see, so I'm wondering what you think of this. We talk a lot about, in terms of understanding or thinking about or exploring non-duality, the subject-object relationship, or the falseness of that dichotomy. And I guess as you were talking, one of the things that occurred to me again is, for me, how much I think about the other dichotomy, which I find both crippling, and to let it go seems to kind of open up this kind of space that it feels like you're talking about, and that is the dichotomy between nouns and verbs, and in that we tend to live in a world of nouns where things get fixed and they seem like that's how they are. Mm-hmm. We like to use verbs, but the idea that every noun is a verb ultimately, and that there's a quality to practice which is always about, to talk about actualization is kind of a crappy word these days, but everything is about actualizing and unfolding in every moment. And so consequently there's always this kind of infinite potentiality in every seemingly fixed thing. And in some way, nouns lead us to forget that. Verbs remind us of that. And the quality of practice where, we live in a world seemingly of objects, but when we think of them as verbs, that there's in everything around us, there's always this potentiality that is just like vibrating in at this moment of unfolding into the next moment, which is always empty space, even though it looks fixed. Whether it's the altar seems so lovely and beautiful and massive and permanent, but it's also in the next moment we don't know. It's as much space as our breath. Yeah.
That's what impermanence is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what life is, and that's why we use the term beings to include objects, right? Everything is alive in that sense, not just things that are biologically functioning. Right? That's exactly.
Jikie, I was thinking of a diagram came to mind with Myopun's question. For me, there's this beautiful book called The Overstory, and half of the book is a bunch of completely unrelated stories, and you get halfway through and you're thinking, what is this? And should I give up? I haven't changed at all, I haven't learned anything from this. And then there's a moment where all of a sudden you're like, oh, I see what's gonna happen, and they start to connect all of these stories, and then the rest of the book unfolds, and also you're completely wrecked. by the end, and that book will actually change how you view the world. And it just reminded me in the same way that when you're reading those first few chapters, kind of like when you sit, you don't see the change, and then all of a sudden there seems to be a moment where you start to get it, but then it's just kind of infinitely happening. So it reminds me more of how you change through reading a book. That first page or first chapter, you don't see it.
Yeah. I mean, that's one way, right? Is that there's something happening that is progressive that we don't see all at once because the pieces are kind of getting put in place or because the changes are small. There's another way of talking about it that when changes in our understanding happen, or when anything happens, it's like completely not happening and then completely is happening, and there's no progression, right? And that those they kind of can't exist at the same time. There's, both of those things are true at the same time. Right? And everybody's, I think, experience of of taking up this practice is a little bit different too. We all are coming from different stories, different causes and conditions, different brains, right? And it's going to be a little bit different for everybody. But yeah.
Okay. The word that is coming very strongly in my mind is Horus. Does that resonate with you?
Horus in what way?
In terms of trying to describe an undescribable reality that is both appearing in our consciousness to be separate and have defined edges, and yet we know that that's not at a nuclear level. That's another reality. So that word, it just comes to me in a very strong way that maybe if we think about reality as porous, it kind of resolves those two things, because porous is not solid.
I think I see what you mean, and that like if we see things that appear solid, but aren't, as if they're full of empty space. That's kind of like being porous.
And things move through.
Things move
each
through.
other. They coexist. All of that.
I like that word as a metaphor, maybe, or an image. I often think about kind of like we think about all the things that appear as contradictions, as opposites, that like somehow Zen practice feels like we're trying to resolve these opposites, and that they're actually complementary so that they make a whole, right? I think all of those images that we use are limited. I mean, it's helpful to have all these little, almost like mnemonics, words that kind of help trigger images in our mind to help us kind of pull out a different thread. But they're all kind of limited in a way too, because it's also completely empty and completely real at the same time. Like, I am definitely here and experiencing myself, and I am definitely me, and I'm definitely not you. And yet, I'm completely impermanent and empty of self-nature, and we are not separate. Completely at the same time.
Jikie. Kind of a lot of the questions kind of led to this thought that I've been having. When I think about my practice, it's often motivated by trying to alleviate sorrow, sadness, and I've been thinking a lot about things like people saying your life will always be different, or sitting is going to change you fundamentally, or considering and sitting zazen is the gate. And I notice in myself, and often there seems to be this air that I perceive of sort of a nihilism almost, like everything, that emptiness is a negative connotation for me. And I've also noticed that the happier I am, my practice sucks. Because I feel like almost I'm dropping that off, like, oh, mission accomplished. But so I wonder if you could speak a little bit about it's very Buddhist too, take suffering as the catalyst to the practice, but you talk a little bit about practicing when you're happy, or cultivating happiness in your practice.
Yeah. You know, we're all called by different things in different ways, and we all kind of have core questions that are different. And some people might find that when life gets difficult, it gets hard to practice. And for other people, when life gets easy, it's like, I don't need that anymore, I'm good, right? And that's where that's a place that vow and commitment and discipline come in, right? Because if we only practice when it feels like natural or when we feel like we need it, then we're gonna learn in a very narrow vein, right? We're cutting ourselves off from a lot that we could learn. And I think that practicing in joy and learning about how emptiness is also completely positive. I mean, we can talk about emptiness or we can talk about fullness, and we're talking about the same thing, right? We feel it one way or the other way, but it's not different, right? And the impermanence is, I think I've said this already this spring, impermanence is falling in love and new babies and puppies and kittens and flowers in the springtime, and it's winter and death and loss and pain. But it's both of those things completely, and if we only ever learn one side of it, then we're missing something. But life won't let us only learn one side of it, right? If you keep showing up and keep practicing, I feel like I'm usually saying the other side of this, like if you're not having great difficulty, don't worry. Life will bring you some. You don't need to try and make it up. But if you're not experiencing the joy and fullness of life, just keep throwing yourself at practice and you will, right? And life will be round. Maybe one more?
Speak about intention.
What about it?
As a force.
We don't do anything without intention, right? It takes volition to act. We also tend to think our intention is a little bit precious, right? That how I intend things to be, what I'm trying to do, is somehow more important than what is actually happening, or kind of justifies the consequences of that. And it doesn't. I'm not sure exactly what to say about it without more thought about what it's happening to you. Where does it feel pointy about intention?
I wonder sometimes, I agree with you that nothing will happen without some intention, but that doesn't mean it should happen because we have it.
That's
right?
true too, right?
So,
yeah.
But sometimes, so I'll intend to meditate, and I will. And it won't go very well, but at least I've meditated, right? Whatever going well really means, I'm not exactly sure. I'm going to have it's gotten more confusing the longer I've tried to do it. And that's, but the act of meditating, the act of sitting, is in itself an intentional act. And I'm assuming that regardless of how poorly it goes, however that's defined, it's, at least I'm pointed in on the right path. And maybe that's as good as it gets.
I think, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, in that moment, right?
Yeah.
So this is back to that, like, everything is already Buddha nature, and yet we have to practice in order to actualize it, right? The world is just fine, right? The world is a complete expression of being, and we are a complete expression of being without us doing anything. But for us to experience and realize and share and unfold that in the world, we have to do something. We have to step up and act. And so that requires intention, right? And our intention will always be limited in some way. Our intention will always be wrong in some way. We will step out and it won't work the way that we thought it was going to, and that in a way doesn't really matter, right? In another way, it matters completely, right? We should be really paying attention to what is our intention and always asking ourselves to clarify that. What is the most important thing that I can do to burn up my life, right? What is my deep intention? I should always be trying to refine that question. And then step out and act on it, even though it is guaranteed to not do what I think it's going to do, right? That's kind of that, going back to that no place to stand, right? And yet that's exactly what we stand up on. And I think that's a good place to stop.